Hi, Lisa. Hi, Sebastian. How are you?
Good to see you.
Thanks for coming on, Lisa.
Our pleasure.
Super excited to have you with us, Lisa. You've been shaping carbon markets for decades. I've been following that work. Hugely important. I'm a big fan of what you have achieved in your different roles and capacities. But what we want to dig into with you is the world of Article 6. Because when we look at what is happening, we are obviously focusing on removals here in the CDR Policy Scoop, but a lot of what we're discussing, applies the same way, whether we talk about removals or reductions or avoidance projects. But we have the reality where many host countries are still building capacity to implement Article 6. At the same time, we have some new, quite important demand signals potentially coming online in the near future. Most importantly, the EU, allowing the use of international credits towards its 2040 targets, which means hundreds of millions of credits worth of demands. And of course, many people expect that, well, the plumbing, the infrastructure is obviously there and it's going to be delivered, but probably it's not going to be maybe as easy as it seems. And one of the elements in this mix for the projects is the letter of authorization and receiving it, right? Basically, it's kind of a written permission by the government to export a piece of its own climate progress. And then there is another thing called corresponding adjustments, on which we just some time ago did a debate here in the Policy Scoop. And this corresponding adjustment is basically a bookkeeping system that makes sure that this climate activity is not counted twice. So you've been...
I love the mug. Show it again.
You can... Yes, you will not be the first one to ask, by the way.
We'll get you one.
Amazing.
So to get us started, Lisa, maybe tell us, what does this letter of authorization actually bind the host country to do? And where does that obligation actually sit, like in the domestic law, or like what does it mean in practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's really an important point I'd love to make. That letter of authorization is an incredibly important and enforceable commitment of the host government. And in fact, when it's insured, subject to an insurance product by KETA or other entities or by MEGA, it becomes a critically important contract. And so that letter of authorization is a commitment by the government, and it's very important now. We know, following KOKO, that it has to be an authorized entity of the government, often the DNA, provides the letter of authorization either directly to an authorized entity, a party, and for the units and for the cooperative approach. So there's three elements of the letter of authorization. It authorizes the entity or entities to use the associated units for a specific purpose. It authorizes the approach, and it authorizes the related units themselves. So it lies generally with the government and a counterparty.
Can you say a bit, because you mentioned KOKO, obviously you know that that's the cookstove project in Kenya that went bankrupt, but I haven't made the connection to letters of authorization. So if this is a good recent example that maybe people have heard of, can you quickly explain what happened with regards to the letters of authorization?
Yes. So the guarantee really hinges on a breach of contract. And most often that contract is the letter of authorization. And in KOKO, we understand that the contract was a framework agreement agreeing to provide the letter of authorization. And there were two government entities involved, as I understand it, the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment, and each argued they didn't have the right authorization, so no one was responsible for providing the letter of authorization, and they didn't have to do it, or that one government entity committed the other to providing the letter of authorization, and they didn't have the proper authority to do it. So that's become very, very controversial in the marketplace, and it's resulted in multiple branches of government being committed to provide the letter of authorization. So making sure you have the right who's the party that can give the letter of authorization, who can cause a government to give an authorization, and who is it enforceable against is really, really, really important. And that's going to be, I think, a key issue in the resolution of the KOKO situation.
Some time ago, at the webinar about Article 6, I heard an argument saying that not all letters of authorization are created equal, that some are not necessarily worth the paper they're written on, that it's very different levels of corruption in different developing countries, and not necessarily, that can happen obviously in all kinds of countries. Is that still true, or given the rule set that has now evolved over the last COPs, like have you been able to close some of these potential loopholes that cause trouble in the market?
Eve, I think this is a great question, and it's a great opportunity to dispel a lot of the confusion in the marketplace. So there are many documents out there floating as part of legislative systems in domestic countries, and they include a letter of approval, which is not a letter of authorization. They include a letter of acknowledgement, which is not a letter of authorization. They include a letter of no objection, which is not a letter of authorization. And then they include letters of authorization in all kinds of different forms, which is not an Article 6 letter of authorization unless it conforms to the exact form stipulated, those minimum requirements stipulated in accordance with the Article 6 guidance and rules. And they're slightly different between Article 6.2 and 6.4. And so I'd love to refer parties to the World Bank website, where we've worked with the World Bank to come up with a model form of letter of authorization, and that will be updated quite shortly to reflect the difference between an Article 6.2 authorization, which can be broader, and an Article 6.4 authorization. Using the UNFCCC formats, but in particular, to get them to be commercial documents, there are key terms and provisions, key terms and conditions that most commercial counterparties want. It's a great question.
And what's the main bottleneck to issue letters of authorization? Because it seems like, I also know project developers who've been waiting years in some instances, talking to governments. Like, is it that the Kenya example where basically who's responsible and that's kind of an issue? Is it more the administrative burden? Like, where is the bottleneck today in issuing these letters?
Also a great question. There are a few key issues for a host government to consider in terms of providing a letter of authorization, because at the end of the day, that is a legally enforceable contract as against the sovereign. I'm going to say that again. A legally enforceable contract as against the sovereign. And so in order to enter into that contract, first of all, the sovereign has to make sure it has the ability to enter into it, and the right branch of the state has to be the entity to give the contract. So they have to be duly authorized to give the letter of authorization. And sometimes the internal machinery, the checks and balances to say, yes, you are the person who gives this authorization, aren't in place. So the government has to go through the process of providing the correct authorizations and authority to do that. Secondly, in relation to the substance of the letter of authorization. The host government is committing to meet generally its Paris obligations and to correspondingly adjust, i.e. to add a plus to emission reductions that go into or that occur in the jurisdiction so they can be sold outside of the jurisdictions. So there should be an amount of diligence done by the host country to make sure that they are acting currently in line with their NDC commitments and that that letter of authorization isn't going to take them wildly offline with their NDC commitments. And so that takes a while as well. And then third, there are some questions as to how does this apply under domestic laws and under the Constitution of the related jurisdiction. Are there any, for example, constitutional prohibitions in relation to natural resources or private property or contracting out that we have to think about and reflect in that letter of authorization? So in fairness to most host countries, it's a process. It's not just write a letter and sign it. And if it is just write a letter and sign it, be cautious, be suspicious, and be careful, because it's going to be worth the paper that it's written on.
Hey, wow, that's such a complex world. One of the very contentious issues for quite some time, and I'm wondering if still, is the potential revocation of letter of authorization. At COP29, we got some clarity, some protection for buyers against revocation after first transfer, unless the letter itself actually reserves that right. How do you see it play out practice? Like today, the letters that are issued, are the countries asking to keep that reservation? Of course, I can imagine it makes the life of project developers and buyers very, very complicated if they do. Or like how is that working in practice?
Yeah, it's been the subject of my last several days. So let's talk about that. Let's go back to that first principle. The letter of authorization authorizes three things: the entity, the ITMOs, and the cooperative approach. Do they generally want to revoke in relation to the cooperative approach? Not really. Do you need to do that? Do they generally want to revoke in terms of the entity? If that entity has breached the letter of authorization or some other agreement between the entity and the sovereign, they probably need to have the ability to revoke the authorization of that corporate or entity. For example, if they've committed a fraud, you don't want to continue to authorize someone who's committed a fraud, right? And then the third thing, which is much more nuanced and much more subtle, is the authorization of the ITMOs or the units themselves. Do we want to have retroactive revocation of ITMOs that have been authorized? Very bad for the market. It's like printing a dollar bill and then having the ability to rip it up. Do they want to be able to revoke the ability of forward and future issuances to an authorized entity that has been the subject of having their authorization of the entity revoked? They probably do. But is that the ITMOs themselves? No. So the key element is revocation of the authorization of an entity who's either breached an agreement or become a bad actor. And I think most countries are definitely reserving that ability right now, and prudently so. You wouldn't want to be in business with someone who's committed a fraud or someone who's violated an agreement with you.
Templates you mentioned that have been developed together with World Bank, are there these revocation options already in there?
There's a real clarification that there's no retroactive revocation of units once first transferred.
If I can also, building on this and coming back to the process you mentioned earlier, what if a government issues an LOA and then by the time these units are going to be, the actual units are going to be issued, they realize that they're not on track with the NDC? what happens in that situation when there was basically a misassessment years earlier? It's the fault of the government. What happens in that situation?
So the short answer is it depends on the terms and conditions of that LOA. Do they have the ability to amend it? That's a question. We provide for the ability to amend on certain conditions. Do they have the ability to revoke it? And on what conditions can they revoke the letter of authorization wholesale? Do they have a positive obligation? And are there effective dates, i.e. this letter of authorization doesn't become effective until this date? So very much a function of the terms and conditions, and that's why these should be very thoughtful and well negotiated documents. It's not just a rubber stamp of the host country.
So one of the later steps, once there is a letter of authorization, the project is running and issuing units, is the corresponding adjustments. And this is something, especially when we look at the use in the voluntary market, that is whether corresponding adjustments are needed or not. It really depends on who you ask and what they think. When we look at the carbon market governance space, then what we see lately is mostly that the disclosure is required, whether a corresponding adjustment is linked to a certain credit. Although SBTi's latest version of the net zero standards also recommends corresponding adjustments still for corporate use. We also had, as I mentioned, a debate here in the Policy Scoop on whether corresponding adjustments are actually needed for VCM. So where do you stand on this?
Yeah. Let's talk about what's required by law and what's best practice. Okay, so required by law, there are two situations in which corresponding adjustments are required. That is when the ITMO is authorized for use towards another NDC, or when the ITMO is authorized for use for other international mitigation purposes, which include a wide range of things. Other purposes, international mitigation purposes, predominantly that's been interpreted as CORSIA or other related bodies. But it could be any other international mitigation purpose as designated by the related NDC, DNA or host country authority. Once those two elements, either one of them are checked, if you're authorizing it for use towards an NDC or towards what we call OIMP, other international mitigation purposes, then you must, by law, correspondingly adjust. Now, we've heard about companies in country or facilitating financing wanting to make contribution claims to help host governments achieve their own NDCs. And in that instance, they might enter into an agreement where the tons are not authorized for use towards another NDC or are not authorized for use for other international mitigation purposes, and no corresponding adjustment is required. However, best practices are such that at a minimum, you notify the host government that you are contributing to a voluntary credit, which is not going to be authorized for use. In that way, you can never have a host government saying, we had no knowledge of this. It's being used for other international mitigation purposes illegally, and we're nationalizing it, expropriating it, canceling it. So when we do that notification, we, in coordination with the World Bank, have called that a letter of acknowledgement. So trying to get some confirmation that you've notified the government that You're not using it for other international mitigation purposes. You're making a contribution claim to help the host government achieve its own commitments, and that the government has acknowledged that that's what you're doing. So it's not authorized, expressly not authorized. And that is an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure approach. And all of that is included in the World Bank guidance document that accompanies the two model letters of authorization.
But now, to follow up on this one, is that then the project developer who would ask the government for this acknowledgement? But sometimes the project developer doesn't know exactly where it's going to sell or whom it's going to sell its units to and what kind of claim that entity will be making. So how does that play into this?
Yeah. So I think that's really important. You have to have the ability to be very clear that you're not acting contrary to domestic laws. For example, if a project developer goes and enters a project and then someone wants to try and use the tons for a CORSIA commitment or for another international mitigation purpose commitment to say, we are mitigating global emissions of this amount, and they haven't got an authorization to do so, that could be very problematic. If they have that intent, and the government hasn't said you don't need an authorization, or if there's no authorization, we acknowledge that you're doing this, then you're going out with a contingent risk. So we like predictability and certainty and truly commercial activities to just basically say, everybody knows what's going on. This is authorized. We acknowledge this doesn't require an authorization. There's no authorization provided. And that helps everybody shape the claims, the disclosures, and what you can and cannot do with the credit.
Ask, where does secondary trading come into this? Because if I have a corresponding adjustment for a unit, it kind of assumes, in my worldview, a very clear path from one country to the other, from one NDC to the other. But what if we want a world where, these units get traded over and over and over again until they're retired at some point, and they move locations around the world many times in that chain? How does that fit into this framework?
Yeah, if they're authorized, for example, for CORSIA, you can see that happening. You can see a secondary market trade happening. And so either the entities that's trading them is authorized. There are probably, depending on the terms and conditions of that letter of authorization, notification requirements. It may be that the associated government wants to know exactly where they land, and there's reporting obligations associated with that if they're authorized. So there are ways to make the secondary market work in a transparent and clear manner for authorized units, whether they're authorized towards an NDC, country to country, or authorized for other international mitigation purposes, largely for CORSIA. In terms of unauthorized units, we see a lot of secondary market trading going on there. But I would caution you to be careful about the claims that you're making. If there hasn't been an initial letter of acknowledgement saying these are not authorized tons, they are not correspondingly adjusted, and we're aware of them. And let me just emphasize why this is so important. In many jurisdictions, you can see the emission reduction, particularly if it's nature-based, be classified or characterized as part of a natural resource, a forest, for example. And if there are constitutional restrictions on trading of natural resources, this might be a problem. So best practice is openness, transparency, making sure that we're all aligned in terms of what is it? Is it an authorized unit? Is it not an authorized unit? And when I say we all, I mean the government is also aligned. And then confirming what the it is and how it might be traded or claimed. It's best practice.
Let's switch gears and look a bit into the future, I was looking at how many projects have been authorized, let's say, since the beginning of 2025 under Article 6. AITA has their Article 6 project directory that anyone can check out online, and around 35 projects only have been authorized with a combined maximum volume of 100 million credits. And there's another 100 million that has been authorized before 2025, on the years leading up to 2025. So these are not very big numbers, especially if I think that the EU alone might have a demand of in hundreds of millions of credits up until 2040. How do you see this market forming? I mean, I keep hearing on one side that there's a lot of interest in developing projects, but then from the countries buying credits, I keep hearing that it's very difficult to buy the credits they want to buy. It's a challenge. If you think about the EU and the plans it has for the future, what comes to mind?
Yeah, in fact, the problem is real, and the CORSIA Supply project is actually looking at these issues. How do we get more credits that are authorized online? And you mentioned two great sources for that information. AITA is outstanding. Also, the Japanese, the Article 6 implementation partnership that's being facilitated through the government of Japan also has really great data. So both of those sources are very, very good. And the key is have certain rules, facilitate uniform and standardized forms, and develop capacity. So once one jurisdiction in a particular continent does something, don't reinvent the wheel. Work with the jurisdictions that have already gone through the painful process of building capacity and facilitate what worked best for you. How do we improve this? And how do we actually keep as much as standard as possible? And I think that's what for example, the World Bank LOA forms are trying to do, what the CORSIA Supply Project is trying to do, and what a number of entities working with the UNFCCC Secretariat in terms of the form of the documents that need to be filed to prove the corresponding adjustment has been done. The BTR, the annual information form, the updated annual report, the annual report itself, all of these things actually are as consistent as possible and as predictable as possible. And I think you've seen a big increase. I like the rate of increase of credits with time, but we do need that standardization to continue and the diligence to continue. The last thing you want is supply in the market that isn't well thought out and is likely to be revoked. We don't want retroactive revocation of units. So as a somewhat stickler of a lawyer, I'd rather see the upfront diligence and proper documentation occur to get to get the units out there.
Great. I don't want to bring in another complex topic because we run out of time, but thank you so much, Lisa. This has been a real lesson on details. I'm sure our audience is going to be very, very appreciative of everything you just shared.
Well, let me return the thanks to both you, Eve, and you, Sebastian. I think you do a fantastic job of really building capacity and really facilitating the growth, the credible growth of this market. So I'm very appreciative and very honored to sit with you.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sure we're going to speak soon again.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Lisa.
Ciao, ciao. Bye now.
Bye.